Dr. David asked me to investigate why we crave sugar when we're stressed. It looks like the story begins here in the brain.
Moments ago, everything was calm. Now these neurons are firing faster. The brain's activity has surged, and it needs more energy. Where will it come from?
Right. I've left the bloodstream and arrived in the liver. These are hepatocytes, liver cells. They look quiet, but they're constantly managing the body's fuel. And they're about to get very busy.
These cells stored glucose for this moment. The brain needs energy, so the liver releases its reserves into the blood. An extraordinary conversation between organs that happens every second unnoticed.
Here it is. The glucose has left the liver and entered the bloodstream. Right now there isn't much, just enough to supply the body's vital organs. But this won't stay quiet for long.
Whoa! I was expecting a few extra glucose molecules, not an entire river. I think I've just been completely drenched.
You know, maybe the body isn't craving sugar at all. Maybe it's solving an energy problem. This little molecule is simply the fastest way to deliver where it's needed most.
The body can release an astonishing amount of glucose when the brain needs energy. But is more glucose solving the problem? Or just buying the brain more time? Let's ask Dr. David.
Hello, I'm Dr. David. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you craved broccoli? Seriously. After a stressful day, after only 4 hours of sleep, how many of us accidentally think, you know what I really need? A bowl of steamed broccoli. Probably not. Instead, we crave chocolate, ice cream, fresh bread. Food that gave us energy, most people see that as a lack of discipline. I don't. I think it's biology. Over the year, I've had countless patients tell me, I know exactly what I should eat. I just don't have enough willpower. Maybe you've said something similar yourself. But before we blame ourselves, I like to ask a different question. What if your body isn't trying to sabotage you? What if it's responding exactly the way it was designed to? That doesn't mean every craving is good for us, but it does mean every craving has a story. And I think that story is worth understanding. Imagine two people. One has been sleeping well, eating regular meal, and managing life reasonably well. The other has slept only 5 hours a night for the past week, skipped lunch twice, and has been under constant pressure at work. That evening, they both walk into the kitchen. They both see the same chocolate bar. Do you think they're equally likely to reach for it? Probably not. Now here's the interesting question. If one person simply more disciplined, or has something inside the brain actually change? Because over the last 20 years, neuroscience has given us a fascinating answer. It turns out that stress, sleep loss, mental fatigue don't just change how hungry we feel. They change what we want to eat. And once you understand why, those craving begins to make a lot of sense. So why does this happen? To answer that, we have to start with the brain itself. One of the most remarkable facts about human brain is how metabolically demanding it is. Although it accounts for only about 2% of our body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of our resting energy expenditure. That's an extraordinary investment for such a small organ. Unlike muscle or liver, however, the brain stores very little energy. Neurons has a high metabolic rate and depends on continuous supply of glucose delivered through the bloodstream. If that supply begins to fall, even briefly, Brain function is one of the first things to suffer. For an evolution perspective, this makes perfect sense. Your brain isn't simply an organ for thinking, it's an organ for survival. Your brain isn't primarily designed to optimize health. It's designed to maintain homeostasis and keeps you functioning in the face of changing demands. Everything else comes after that. The brain is constantly asking a different question. Do I have sufficient energy to meet the demand I'm facing? That's a subtle but important distinction because the answer depends on two things. Not only how much energy is available, but how much energy that the brain predicts it will need. Modern neuroscience is increasingly recognizing that the brain is functionally a predictive organ. It's continuously integrating information about sleep, stress, previous experiences, and external environment to anticipate future demands rather than simply reacting to them. That predictive biology has important consequences. The brain is continuously integrating information about your physiologic states, sleep, nutrition, physical activities, inflammations, and psychological stress to estimate whether future energy demands are likely to exceed available resources. If it predicts that the margin of safety is narrowing, it begins responding before energy stores become critically depleted. That isn't a malfunction. It's an adaptive response that has helped humans survive for thousands of years. One of the earliest responses is activations of the sympathetic nervous system together with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis signals the liver to mobilize glucose through glucogenolysis and, when necessary, includes glucose production through gluconeogenesis. This is a highly coordinated physiological response designed to preserve glucose availability for organs with high metabolic demands, particularly the brain. At the same time, chronic sleep restrictions and sustained psychological stress has been shown to alter neural activity within the brain's reward network while reducing activities in regions of prefrontal cortex involved in executive functions and behavioral regulation. In other words, stress doesn't simply change how much energy is available, it also changes how the brain evaluates food. In other words, the biology changes on two fronts. The result is highly coordinated biological response. The body increases glucose availability while the brain becomes more responsive to food that provide rapid energy. From a physiological perspective, that makes perfect sense. The challenge is that the response designed to protect us during short periods of adversity become increasingly maladaptive when it is activated day after day. That's where modern biology collides with modern environments. What we've discussed so far represents normal physiology. The stress response is highly effective because it is designed to be temporary. It rapidly mobilizes energy, reallocate metabolic resources, and prepares the body to meet an immediate increase in demand. Under normal circumstances, once that demand has passed, the system returns to baseline. Stress hormone falls, glucose metabolism normalizes, and the body shifts from mobilization back to recovery and repair. The ability to move efficiently between these two states is one of the hallmarks of a healthy physiology. The problem is that modern life is different. Today, many of us experience chronic psychological stress, fragmented sleep, and continuous mental demand for months or even years. The biology, however, hasn't fundamentally changed. It continues to activate many of these same pathways that once protected us during short-term adversity. And this is where modern medicines become particularly interesting. Repeat activations of the stress response doesn't simply influence appetite, it changes metabolism. Persistent elevations in stress hormones can reduce insulin sensitivity, making it more difficult for tissue to respond appropriately to glucose. Over time, the pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. At the same time, elevated insulin level favor energy storage, particularly within visceral fat around the abdominal organs. That's one reason chronic stress is associated not only with sugar craving, but also with weight gain, insulin resistance, and an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Notice what has happened. The biology itself isn't defective. The response is simply being activated far more often and for far longer than it was designed to be. I think that's an important distinction. In medicines, we often think of disease as something that's broken, but many chronic diseases begin with biologic systems that are functioning exactly as they evolved to function. The problem is that the environment has changed. The signal never stops, and eventually, the system designed to protect us starts contributing to disease. So if these responses are normal, why should we pay attention to them? The answer lies in one of the most important concepts in modern physiology. It's called allostasis. Homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. Allostasis goes one step further. It describes the body's ability to actively adjust its physiology in anticipation of changing demands, rather than simply maintaining a fixed internal state. These adjustments are not signs of dysfunction. They are the very mechanism that allow us to adapt, survive, and recover. In the short term, that's exactly what we want. The problem arises when adaptations never get the opportunity to resolve. Physiologists refer to this as allostatic load, the cumulative biologic cost of repeatedly activating the system that keeps us alive. The challenge is that every adaptation comes with a physiological cost. When these systems are activated occasionally, the cost is small and fully reversible. But when activation becomes chronic, the body begins to make long-term adjustment in an effort to preserve function. At first, these changes are compensatory. They help maintain stability despite ongoing stress. Over time, however, compensation gradually gives way to dysfunction as the body capacity to adapt begins to erode. This transition rarely occurs suddenly. It unfolds over years, often long before conventional tests meets the threshold for disease. And I think that's an important shift in how we think about health. Disease rarely appears suddenly. More often, it represents the end of a long period of physiological adaptation. By the time blood sugar crosses the threshold for diabetes, or blood pressure meets the definitions of hypertension, the biology has often been changing for years. The challenge is that adaptation is not without consequence. Every physiological adjustment carries an energetic and biological cost. When the demand is temporary, those costs are offset through recovery, allowing normal functions to be restored. But when the same adaptive pathways remain persistently activated, the body gradually shifts from a short-term adaptation to long-term compensation. Initially, compensation is remarkably effective. It preserves physiological function despite ongoing stress, often masking the underlying strain. Over time, however, the capacity to compensate begins to diminish. What was once adaptive gradually becomes maladaptive, and subtle metabolic changes emerge long before conventional measures identify disease. I think this is one of the most important concepts in medicine. Disease is rarely an abrupt event. More often, it represents the point in which years of successful physiological compensations are no longer sufficient to maintain normal function. Important lessons from today's discussion isn't about sugar at all. It's about how we understand symptoms. For much of modern medicines, we've become exceptionally good at recognizing disease once it reaches a diagnostic threshold. But biology doesn't change overnight. Long before disease becomes visible, the body is already adapting, compensating, and attempting to preserve normal function. That's why symptoms deserve our attention. Not because every symptom is a disease, but because every symptom raises an important physiological question. What is the body trying to accomplish? I think that's one of the most powerful questions we can ask in medicine. A sugar craving isn't simply a lapse in willpower. It's a clue, a glimpse into how your brain, your metabolism, and your hormonal systems are responding to the demands of being placed upon them. When we stop seeing symptoms as isolated problems to eliminate and begin seeing them as signals within a complex adaptive system, our understanding of health begins to change. Health is no longer simply the absence of disease. It's an ongoing ability of biological systems to adapt, recover, maintain function in the face of life's challenges. Perhaps that's the real goal. Not to silence every symptom, but to understand the biology that gave rise to it. Because when we ask better biological questions, we often discover better answers. If we enjoy exploring the science behind how the body really works, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of Hidden Biology. If you found this video valuable, a like or share really help the channel reach more people. If there's a topic you'd like me to discover next, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.